بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام الأتمان الأكملان على خير خلق الله أجمعين، وعلى آله وصحبه ومن اهتدى بهديه واستنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وعملا، وأرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه، وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه، واجعلنا ممن يستمعون القول فيتبعون أحسنه. آمين يا رب العالمين. وبعد، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. We continue on to another session of our course that we are conducting on the commentary of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah's Al-Aqidah Al-Hamawiyah, or Al-Fatwa Al-Hamawiyah. And so last week we went through some further points that the Shaykh mentioned concerning the reality of the position of Ahlul Ta'til and some of the necessary implications of their position. And then how the Shaykh spoke about the roots of their views, how it can be traced back to basically to other religions and other philosophies besides Islam, and the influence of one particular individual by the name of Bishr al-Marisi, the Mu'tazili, how his position and his influence had a huge impact in the spread of ta'atil and denial of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the Shaykh mentioned several refutations of the Jahmiyyah and Bishr al-Marisi in particular by the ulama of the Salaf and those who came after them. And so he mentioned several important books from that early period in our Islamic history and Islamic scholarship. And so we move on today. We move on today to continue from where we left off. And so we begin with a new chapter. The Shaykh says fasl, which means chapter, faslun. He says فصل ثم القول الشامل في جميع هذا الباب أن يوصف الله بما وصف به نفسه أو وصفه به رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم وبما وصفه به السابقون الأولون لا يتجاوز القرآن والحديث. And so here the Shaykh is now going to give us an overview of the position of Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah concerning Allah's attributes. In just one sentence and one paragraph, he gives us the correct position concerning Allah's attributes. And so he says that the all-comprehensive statement that we can give concerning this topic of Allah's attributes is that Allah is to be attributed with what he attributed himself with, and what his messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam attributed him with, and what the early Muslims attributed Allah with. None of that surpassed and went beyond the Quran and the Hadith. None of that surpassed or went beyond the Quran and the Hadith. And then he quotes Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. He says, قال الإمام أحمد ibn Hanbal لا يوصف الله إلا بما وصف به نفسه أو وصفه به رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يتجاوز القرآن والحديث. That Allah is not attributed with anything except what he attributed himself with or what his messenger attributed him with. None of that surpasses the Quran and the Hadith. And then he says that the madhab of the Salaf, he says, وَمَذْهَبُ السَّلَفِ أَنَّهُمْ يَصِفُونَ اللَّهَ بِمَا وَصَفَ بِهِ نَفْسُهُ وَبِمَا وَصَفَهُ بِهِ رَسُولُهُ صلى الله عليه وسلم من غير تحريف ولا تعطيل ومن غير تكييف ولا تمثيل. He says that the madhab and the way of the Salaf is the same thing, to attribute to Allah what he himself attributed himself with and what his messenger attributed him with without four things. And then he mentions the four things. And we're going to go through each one of these four things that he mentioned. He says, without tahrif and without ta'atil and without takyif and without tamthil. He says that the madhab of the Salaf is to attribute to Allah what he attributed himself with and to attribute to Allah what his messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam attributed him with without falling into four dangers and four deviations, without tahrif and without ta'til and without takyif and without tamthil. So what do we mean by these terminologies? We've already gone through some of these terms previously, And anyone studying this course should be familiar with these terminologies. But let us, inshallah ta'ala, give a definition of each one of these. And I have added two more. I have added two more terms that are related to what we're talking about. And so it's important for us to be familiar with these terminologies and their definition. So the first thing is tahrif. What does tahrif mean? It means to change a text in its wording or in its meaning. To change a text either in its wording or in its meaning. And so there are some who either change the words of the text, or they change the meanings, or they change books. And so Allah tells us about the Jews. يُحَرِّفُونَ الْكَلِمَةَ عَنْ مَوَاضِعِهِ. That the Jews, they would change the words from their places. And so Allah uses the word يُحَرِّفُونَ. They change, they distort, they twist. And that's what the Jews were known for. As for the meaning, changing the meaning, then this is what the mutakallimun do, Ahlul Kalam. And so they go to the attributes of Allah and they say it does not mean this, it means this. So changing the meaning of the words. And they refer to this as ta'weel. They refer to this as ta'weel. So tahrif and ta'weel basically mean the same thing. Tahrif and ta'weel mean the same thing, except that ta'weel is a term that the mutakallimun and the asha'ira, they feel more comfortable using the word ta'weel because it has a good connotation to it. And so in the past, in the time of the Salaf, ta'weel used to mean tafsir. Ta'weel used to mean tafsir. And that's why the great scholar of tafsir, the Mufassir Ibn Jarir al-Tabari, the title of his tafsir was ta'weel. And so ta'weel means interpretation, to interpret something. So they say we are simply interpreting the Quran and the Sunnah. We are interpreting Allah's names and attributes. But we say no, what you're doing is actually tahrif. And so what you're doing is more correctly described as being tahrif and not ta'weel. But either way, call it what you want, it's the same thing. Tahrif is ta'weel. The second term that we have is ta'atil. Ta'atil, we already mentioned ta'atil several times, and the people of ta'atil. And so ta'atil is to deny Allah's names and attributes, or to deny some of them. So to deny Allah's names and attributes in the absolute sense or in the partial sense. So to either deny all of Allah's attributes or to deny some of them. And in the Arabic language, ta'atil is from the word aqal, which means that something does not have something. To say that there is something that is stripped of such and such quality. So you are stripping Allah of his qualities, his attributes. And so ta'til means deny. The third word that he mentions, takyif. And so takyif basically means to describe the attributes of Allah, to describe how they are, or to ask how they are. So to believe, to have a certain belief concerning how Allah's attributes are, or to ask the question of how Allah's attributes are. So that is the meaning of takyif. The fourth term that Shaykh mentions is tamthil. And so tamthil and tashbih. I've added tashbih here because these are two similar terminologies. So let's look at each one. Tamthil means to basically equate Allah's attributes to the attributes of his creation. To believe that Allah's attributes are like the attributes of his creation. That they are just like the attributes of his creation. Equating them. They are equal to the attributes of his creation. On the other hand, tashbih is to believe that Allah's attributes are similar to the attributes of his creation. Are similar. So that's the difference. Tamthil is equality and tashbih is similarity. And this goes both ways. Comparing Allah to his creation or comparing the creation to Allah. Tamthil of Al-Khaliq with Al-Makhluq, or tamthil of the Makhluq with the Khaliq. To compare the creator with his creation, or to compare the creation to the creator. As for the last term that I have mentioned here, and that is ilhad, the reason I mentioned it is because this term will come a few times in the words of Ibn Taymiyyah. So he mentions this word quite often. And so ilhad, it comes in the Quran actually. Allah mentions it. That those who do ilhad in the names of Allah. وَالَّذِينَ يُلْحِدُونَ فِي أَسْمَائِهِ. So what does ilhad in the names of Allah and his attributes, what does it mean? It means basically to deviate from what is required of belief. So it's a deviation. To deviate from the correct belief concerning Allah's names and attributes. And so a person who does ilhad is known as a mulhid. Is known as a mulhid. So ilhad covers pretty much everything that we have mentioned, all of these terms. Ilhad is basically a term that we can use that covers all 4 points that Shaykh al-Islam mentioned. So it includes tahrif, ta'atil, takyif, and tamthil. So ilhad, with respect to Allah's names and attributes, is to deny them, to compare them, to talk about how they are. All of this comes under ilhad. Now, in modern times, ilhad is a term that has a different meaning in the Arabic language. So when we say ilhad, it has become a term that is used specifically to describe atheism. And so in the past, atheism was not an issue. It was a non-issue. So the ulama would not really, have a name for it, specifically for those who deny the existence of Allah. They didn't have a specific name for it. But now, in our day and age, because we have atheists, this is the term that is used for that. Ilhad means atheism. A mulhid is an atheist. And so it's important that we do not confuse that our classical ulama of the past, when they would use this term, ilhad or mulhid, we should not get confused and think that they're talking about atheists. But rather, when they say ilhad or mulhid, they're referring to basically anyone who deviates from the truth. Anyone who deviates from the truth. And in the context that we're speaking about here, anyone who deviates from the truth concerning Allah's names and attributes. And so Ibn Taymiyyah, he goes on to say, وَنَعْلَمُ أَنَّ مَا وُصِفَ اللَّهُ بِهِ مِنْ ذَلِكَ فَهُوَ حَقٌّ لَيْسَ فِيهِ لُغْزٌ وَلَا أَحَاجِيٌّ بل معناه يعرف من حيث يعرف مقصود المتكلم بكلامه. He says, and this is something very important, he says that whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has been described with of attributes, we know for a fact that it is the truth. And there is no ambiguity in it. These words that Allah has used and the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam has used to describe Allah, they are not a puzzle. They are not a riddle that we have to try to solve. It's not a riddle where, we've been told about Allah and we have to now figure out how to, unsolve this mystery. He says, rather, the meanings of Allah's attributes that have been mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah are just like the meanings that are known when anyone speaks with kalam. So anyone who speaks and mentions something and describes something, you understand something from that. It has meanings that are understandable. And so if someone comes to you and says, for example, yesterday I went to the market and I went to this particular shop and I purchased such and such product, and then I came back home, for example. This is kalam, this is speech. Anyone who hears it understands. Anyone who hears it understands. They are meanings that are understandable. He says, لا سيما إذا كان المتكلم أعلم الخلق بما يقول وأفصح الخلق في بيان العلم وأنصح الخلق في البيان والتعريف والدلالة والإرشاد. He says, especially when the one who is speaking in this case is who? It is the Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And how is the Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, described? He is the most knowledgeable of Allah's creation with respect to what he says. This is the first quality. He is the most knowledgeable of Allah's creation with respect to what he says and speaks. Secondly, he is the most eloquent of Allah's creation in getting the message across. He has this capability. Allah has given him this capability to speak in a manner that is clear and the message gets across. And thirdly, he is, the most concerned about getting the message across. He is the one who is most sincere in wanting to advise his ummah and make them learn and keen to guide them. So these are the traits and the characteristics of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If this is who we're talking about, the one who is describing Allah to us, how is it possible to believe that the words that he used to describe Allah are a riddle and a puzzle left for us to try to figure out, and the meanings are unclear to us? He goes on to say, وَهُوَ سُبْحَانَهُ مَعَ ذَلِكَ لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ لَا فِي نَفْسِهِ الْمُقَدَّسَةِ الْمَذْكُورَةِ في أسمائه وصفاته ولا في أفعاله فما نتيقن أن الله سبحانه له فكما نتيقن أن الله سبحانه له ذات حقيقة وله أفعال حقيقة فكذلك له صفات الحقيقة وهو ليس كمثله شيء لا في ذاته ولا في صفاته ولا في أفعاله. Here he mentions, basically, he says, after mentioning this this brief, overview of the position of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah concerning Allah's attributes, this is what we believe concerning Allah's attributes. We believe in whatever Allah has described concerning himself and the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, without tahrif, without ta'til, without taklif, without tamthil. And these attributes have meanings that we can understand. After mentioning all of this, he says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even though he has described himself to us in words that are clear and understandable, none of that is like the names and attributes of his creation. So here he's talking about tamthil. That although we affirm attributes of perfection for Allah, at the same time, we are not saying that Allah is like his creation. Not in his names, nor in his attributes, nor in his actions. And then he gives a beautiful example. And this example is actually a rule and a guideline that Ibn Taymiyyah has mentioned elsewhere. And in particular in his book At-Tadmuriyah, which is a more advanced book in Aqidah and in concerning Allah's names and attributes. And so that rule that he mentions, he does not mention it with the same words there. Basically, that rule is القول في الذات القول في الصفات كالقول القول في الصفات كالقول في الذات. القول في الصفات كالقول في الذات. That what we say concerning the attributes is as we say concerning Allah's that, his very essence, his very being. Or the opposite, القول في الذات كالقول في الصفات. What we say about Allah's that, his very being, his very essence, we say the same thing about Allah's attributes. So Ibn Taymiyyah says, just like here what he says is, فكما نتيقن أن الله له ذات حقيقة وله أفعال حقيقة, just like we believe with yaqeen that Allah has a that, an essence, a being that is real, حقيقة, and that he has actions that are real. No one denies this. Then فكذلك له صفات حقيقة. Then he also has attributes that are real. وهو ليس كمثله شيء لا في ذاته ولا في صفاته ولا في أفعاله. And there is nothing like him, not in his that, nor in his صفات, nor in his أفعال, his actions. And so if someone says he does not believe in any attributes of Allah, we say, do you not believe in Allah and his existence? He'll say, of course, Allah exists. So we say to him, just like you believe that Allah exists and that he is a real being, then say the same thing with regards to Allah's attributes. Because they are a part of Allah. And just like we cannot compare Allah's being to the beings of his creation, likewise we cannot compare the attributes of Allah to the attributes of his creation. After that, the Shaykh, he says, concerning that which we have to negate from Allah, he says, وَكُلُّ مَا أَوْجَبَ نَقْصًا أَوْ حُدُوثًا فإن الله منزه عنه حقيقة فإن الله سبحانه مستحق للكمال الذي لا غاية فوقه ويمتنع عليه الحدوث لامتناع العدم عليه واستلزام الحدوث سابقة العدم والافتقار المحدث إلى محدث ووجوب وجوده في نفسه. Basically, what he says here is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not like his creation. Why? Because the creation is something that comes into being after it never existed. And also our attributes and our actions have a beginning. They come into existence after never existing before. As for Allah, that cannot apply to Allah. That cannot apply to Allah. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the first with no beginning. And so we cannot trace any beginning to Allah. Allah is the first and there was no one before him. Likewise, his attributes. Likewise, the attributes of Allah. The attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have been with Allah from the beginning. So we cannot compare what is eternal to what has a beginning, and that is the creation. So this is what we have to declare Allah as being free of. And, this is something deficient. This is a deficient quality of ours, of the creation, that, we are not described as being eternal, pre-eternal. And so we have a beginning and we have an end. And that is not the case for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. After this, the Shaykh goes on to talk about how the position of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah is a moderate one between two extremes, between ta'til and tamthil. Between ta'til and tamthil. And we've already explained what each one of these two things mean. And so he says, وَمَذْهَبُ السَّلَفِ بَيْنَ التَّعْطِيلِ وَبَيْنَ التَّمْثِيلِ فلا يمثلون صفات الله بصفات خلقه كما لا يمثلون ذاته بذات خلقه ولا ينفون عنه ما وصف به نفسه أو وصفه به رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم فيعطلون أسماءه الحسنى وصفاته العليا ويحرفون الكلم عن مواضعه ويلحدون في أسماء الله وآياته. He says that the madhab of the Salaf is between ta'til and tamthil. So ta'til being denial of Allah's attributes, and tamthil being comparing or likening Allah to His creation. And so he says, the Salaf and Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah do not compare the attributes of Allah to the attributes of His creation. Just like they do not compare the essence, the that of Allah to the that of His creation. And they do not deny what Allah has described Himself with and what His Messenger described Him with. So they do not fall into ta'til either. So they don't fall into tamthil, nor do they fall into ta'til, stripping Allah of His names and His attributes that He has described Himself with, and changing the words of Allah and doing ilhad with regards to Allah's names and attributes and His ayat. And then after this, he mentions a very, very important point. And that is that the people of ta'til who deny Allah's attributes, whether in the absolute sense or in the partial sense, whether they deny the words or they deny the meanings, and they change the meanings, and they say we don't believe in the apparent meanings of Allah's attributes. He says that the people of ta'til also fell into tamthil, and that the people of tamthil fell into ta'til. And so every mu'attil, a person of ta'til, is a mumathil, a person of tamthil. And every mumathil, person of tamthil, is a mu'attil, a person of ta'til. And so he says, وكل واحد من فريقي التعطيل والتمثيل فهو جامع بين التعطيل والتمثيل. He says both camps, the people of ta'til and the people of tamthil, both of them combine between ta'til and tamthil. Both of them combined between ta'til and tamthil. And then he explains how. He explains how that is. And so he says, أما المعطلون, as for the people of ta'til, they did not understand Allah's names and attributes except by what was suitable for the creation of Allah. So basically, the people of ta'til, and here he's referring to the mutakallimun and the mu'tazila and the asha'ira, who say, we don't believe in these apparent meanings of Allah's attributes. So they are people of ta'til. These people, what happened is that they first understood the names and attributes of Allah in the context of His creation. So, for example, Allah says He has a hand. Allah says He has a face. An image comes to their mind concerning that. A figure comes to their mind of a body, a shape, etc. So they fell into what? They fell into tamthil. They first fell into tamthil. He says, ثم شرعوا في نفي تلك المفهومات. Then after they realized their deviation, realized that, what am I doing? What are we doing? We cannot imagine Allah in this way. In order to escape and get out of that hole, what did they do? They fell into ta'til. Their solution was ta'til. Their solution was, we have to get rid of these ideas completely. And so we cannot believe in any meanings for these attributes of Allah. So the Shaykh says, فَقَدْ جَمَعُوا بَيْنَ التَّمْثِيلِ وَالتَّعْطِيلِ. And so they combined between tamthil and ta'til. مَثَّلُوا أَوَّلًا وَعَطَّلُوا آخِرًا. First, they did tamthil, then they did ta'til. And then he gives examples. He says, if one of them was to say Allah is above the throne, that would mean that He is either larger than the throne, or He is smaller than the throne, or He is equal in size to the throne. So basically, here what he's doing, Ibn Taymiyyah, he's giving us an example of the process by which these people deviate. So they said, if Allah is above the throne, and He has told us in the Quran that He is above the throne, He's settled above the throne, then either, so this is them delving into this attribute of Allah, al-istiwa. This is them delving into it by doing tamthil, even if it be in their minds. And so they said either Allah is larger than the throne, or He is smaller, or He is equal in size. There's no other possibility. So then they said, all three possibilities are false. All three possibilities are false. Therefore, we cannot believe that Allah is above the throne in the real sense. So you see how they went from tamthil to ta'til. And so Ibn Taymiyyah, he says, فإنه لم يفهم من كون الله على العرش إلا ما يثبت لأي جسم كان على أي جسم. He didn't understand concerning the istiwa of Allah above his throne. He didn't understand that except by what he understands and what he perceives from his experience. And that is a person sitting on something. One body being on another body. One body being on another body. And then he says, and then Ibn Taymiyyah says, وأما استواء يليق بجلال الله ويختص به فلا يلزمه شيء من هذه اللوازم الثلاثة الباطلة التي يجب نفيها كما يلزم سائر الأجسام. He says that as for an istiwa that is suitable for Allah and specific to him, then none of these three possibilities that they mentioned come under that. For us to say that these are the three possibilities, if neither of them are possible, therefore we have to negate this attribute from Allah. No. We as Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, our solution to this is to say that right from the very get-go, right from the very start, we say that Allah's istiwa, him settling and rising above the throne, is unlike anyone else's. It cannot be compared to anyone else's. Allah is above his throne in the real sense, but in a manner befitting himself, in a manner that is specific to him, that no one else shares with him. And then he gives the example of how the mumathil, the person of tamthil, fell into ta'wil. So he finished talking about how the people of ta'wil combined tamthil with their ta'wil. Now he's going to talk about the people of tamthil. And so the people of tamthil are those who compare Allah to his creation. So they say that these attributes of Allah mentioned in the Quran and in the Sunnah are exactly like ours. The opposite extreme, basically. So he says, that وصار هذا مثل قول الممثل إذا كان للعالم صانع فإما أن يكون جوهرا أو عرضا وكلاهما محال إذ لا يعقل موجودا إلا هذان أو قوله إذا كان مستويا على العرش فهو مماثل لاستواء الإنسان على السرير أو الفلك إذ لا يعلم الاستواء إلا هكذا. So basically he says that a mumathil, a person of tamthil, says that if Allah is above his throne, then it has to be just like a human being sits on his throne, like a king who sits on his throne. Why? Because there's no other way to understand al-istiwa. Okay, so he did tamthil. How does he do ta'til? So how is the person of tamthil a mu'attil? Basically, he stripped a lot of what is befitting for Allah. And so he stripped a lot of the correct meaning. he stripped Allah of correct meaning concerning him rising and settling above the throne. And then after that, he explains what the correct belief is concerning the istiwa of Allah. And so he says, وَالْقَوْلُ الْفَاصِلُ هُوَ مَا عَلَيْهِ الْأُمَّةِ الْوَسَطِ من أن الله مستو على عرشه استواء يليق بجلاله ويختص به فكما أنه موصوف بأنه بكل شيء عليم وعلى كل شيء قدير وأنه سميع بصير ونحو ذلك ولا يجوز أن يثبت للعلم والقدرة خصائص الأعراض التي لعلم المخلوقين وقدرتهم فكذلك هو سبحانه فوق العرش ولا يثبت لفوقية خصائص فوقية المخلوق على المخلوق ولوازمها. And so basically he says that um, he says that the position of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah is the moderate, balanced position between these two extremes, the extreme of the people of Ta'atil and the extreme of the people of Tamthil. And that is to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is above his throne in a manner befitting himself and specific to him. And then he says that just like Allah is described with ilm, with knowledge, so he is al-alim, and he is described with qudra, with power, and that he is described as being sami' basir, the all-hearing, the all-seeing, etc. And that we're not allowed to compare any of these attributes to attributes of Allah to the attributes of his creation. Then likewise, Allah his istiwa above his throne is uncomparable to the istiwa of the creation. And this brings us to another rule that Ibn Taymiyyah has mentioned elsewhere, like in his book At-Tadmuriyah. And so we mentioned one, and that was al-qawlu في الصفات كالقول في الذات, or القول في الذات كالقول في الصفات. That whatever you say about Allah's attributes, it's just like what you will say about Allah's being, his very essence. That's one rule. Another rule here is القول في بعض الصفات كالقول في البعض الآخر. That basically whatever you say about some of Allah's attributes, the same exact thing should be said about Allah's other attributes. القول في بعض الصفات القول في بعض الصفات الأخرى. That whatever you say about some of Allah's attributes, the same thing applies to Allah's other attributes. And so the Asha'ira and also the Maturidiyah, they affirm certain attributes for Allah, that they do not change its meanings. And they are seven. They are seven attributes of Allah. And among these attributes is Allah's life and His knowledge and His qudra, His power, and so on and so forth. So these are attributes that they believe in and they don't change its meanings. So here, Shaykh al-Islam is using this against them. That whatever you say about those attributes, say the same thing about Allah's other attributes. Be consistent. Be consistent. And so just like you do not say about Allah's knowledge that you don't come up with possibilities. You don't say, okay, so Allah's knowledge, this attribute of knowledge, these are the possibilities, A, B, C, and then you look for how to negate those possibilities. Just like they did with regards to Allah being above the throne. So they said either He is larger than the throne, smaller, equal in size. Since none of these is possible, therefore He is not above the throne in the real sense. Why did He do that with Allah being above His throne and His other attributes that you negated? And you did not do that with these 7 attributes. And then after that, the Shaykh goes on to mention how there is nothing in the sound intellect, العقل الصريح, nor in the authentic transmission, النقل الصحيح. There is nothing in the sound intellect or in the authentic revelation, anything that goes against the methodology of Sunnah wal Jama'ah concerning Allah's attributes. He says, however, I'm not able to delve into this in detail. He says, whoever has a shubha, a doubt in his heart, and he wants to find a solution for it, then the way for that is easy. So basically what he's saying here is, in one sentence, he says, واعلم أنه ليس في العقل الصريح ولا في النقل الصحيح ما يوجب مخالفة الطريقة السلفية أصلا، لكن هذا الموضع لا يتسع الجواب عن الشبهات الواردة على الحق، فمن كان في قلبه شبهة وأحب حلها فذلك سهل يسير. Basically what he mentions here, he has delved into elsewhere. And that is specifically his book, درء تعارض العقل والنقل. The way to clarify and show how the sound intellect does not oppose the authentic revelation of Allah. Because basically, the mutakallimun assume that there are certain things in the Quran and the Sunnah that go against our sound intellects. And so that's why they said we have to prefer the intellect over what may have come in the Quran and the Sunnah. We have to give preference to our intellect. And so that is where he refutes them in that book and elsewhere as well. All right. What we will do here is we'll take a quick 5-minute break and then we'll come back, inshallah ta'ala. All right, inshallah ta'ala, let us continue from where we left off. So, after speaking about ta'atil and tamthil and the position of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah between these two extremes, he now goes on to talk about the people of Ta'wil refuting their position, refuting Ahl Ta'wil, those who saw the need to change the meaning, those who saw the need to change the meanings of Allah's attributes. And so he says, first of all, describing their confusion and them how they are inconsistent in their views. He says, ثم المخالفون للكتاب والسنة وسلف الأمة من المتأولين لهذا الباب في أمر مريج. Those who oppose the Quran and the Sunnah and the Salaf of the Ummah from among the people of Ta'wil in this particular context, Ta'wil of Allah's attribute, they are in a constant state of confusion. فإن من ينكر الرؤية يزعم أن العقل يحيلها وأنه مضطر فيها إلى التأويل. He says, those who deny the ru'ya of Allah, that Allah will be seen in the akhirah, and they are the Mu'tazila, they claim that the human intellect finds that to be impossible. Therefore, we are forced to do ta'wil and say that anywhere where ru'ya, Allah being seen, is mentioned, it means something else. And then he says, وَمَنْ زَعَمَ أَنَّ اللَّهَ لَيْسَ فَوْقَ الْعَرْشِ يَزْعُمْ أَنَّ الْعَقْلَ أَحَالَ ذَلك وَأَنَّهُ مُضْطَرٌ إِلَى التَّأْوِيلِ. The same thing with those who deny Allah being above His throne. They say the same thing, that the intellect opposes this, finds this to be impossible. Therefore, we are forced to we are forced to do ta'wil. ومن يحيل أن لله علما وقدرة وأن يكون كلامه غير مخلوق ونحو ذلك يقول إن العقل أحال ذلك فاضطر إلى التأويل. The same thing with those who say that it's impossible that Allah has knowledge and power and that His kalam, that it cannot be that it cannot be real speech, but rather it is makhlooq, it is created. They say the same thing, that our intellects found this to be impossible. Therefore, we are forced to do ta'wil. And then he takes it a step further. He says, بل من ينكر حقيقة حشر الأجساد والأكل والشرب الحقيقي في الجنة يزعم أن العقل أحال ذلك وأنه مضطر إلى التأويل. He says, those who deny the reality of resurrection, those who deny that our bodies will be resurrected, and those who deny that there is real eating and drinking in Jannah, their denial is based on the same justification. They say that the aql, the intellect, finds these things to be impossible and that they are now forced to do ta'wil. So here what the Shaykh does is he basically puts them all into one camp. And so those who deny the resurrection and what Allah has told us about Jannah and the na'im, the pleasures of Jannah, here he is talking about the philosophers, not the mutakallimun. Here he's not talking about the Mu'tazila or the Asha'ira. He's talking about the philosophers, the likes of Farabi and Ibn Sina, uh, philosophers who attributed themselves to Islam and who are known as, Muslim philosophers. They actually denied these things. Uh, they denied and they did ta'wil. So they said, uh, these things are not real, and they gave metaphorical meanings to these things, these concepts of resurrection, of the pleasures of Jannah, etc. And so basically, he's saying that he's trying to send a message across to the mutakallimun: be consistent. Be consistent. If you want to say that you're forced to do ta'wil because your human intellect cannot, perceive the reality of Allah's attribute, then do the same with everything else. Do the same with the concepts of the akhirah, the day of judgment, about Jannah, etc. Be consistent. And then he goes on to mention this point that none of them are consistent. ويكفيك دليلا على فساد قول هؤلاء أنه ليس لواحد منهم قاعدة مستمرة فيما يقيله العقل، بل منهم من يزعم أن العقل جوز وأوجب ما يدعي الآخر أن العقل أحال. He said none of them are consistent. What some of them consider the intellect to find impossible, others find the intellect to be possible in that thing. And what some of them find the intellect to be possible in something, others find it to be impossible in that thing. And so he says, فَيَا لَيْتَ شِعْرِي بِأَيِّ عَقْلٍ يُوزَنُ الْكِتَابُ السُّنَّةِ فَرَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنِ الْإِمَامِ مالك ابن أنس حيث يقول: أو كلما جاءنا رجل أجدى من رجل تركنا ما جاء به جبريل إلى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم لجدل هؤلاء. He says, by what aql, by what intellect should we measure the Quran and the Sunnah? And then he mentions the statement of Imam Malik ibn Anas, who said that every single time one man comes to us that is, more clever or more capable of debating than another man, because people used to come to him to debate. So he says every single time one person comes and he's better than another in debating, should that mean that we leave and abandon what Allah sent Jibreel with to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam just because of the argumentation of these people, just because they're able to argue and debate using logic? And then he says, وَكُلٌّ مِّنْ هَؤُلَاءِ مَخْصُومٌ بِمِثْلِ مَا خَصَمَ بِهِ الْآخَرُ وَهُوَ مِنْ وُجُوهٍ. Now he goes on to refute the people of Ta'wil. And he says that basically, just like they refuted one another, we can use those same refutations against them as a whole. And so he mentions 4 points. He mentions 4 points that clarify, or 4 points of refutation against the people of Ta'wil. So the people of Ta'wil, again, are those who said that we cannot believe in Allah's attributes in the meanings, the apparent meanings, and we are forced to Ta'wil. We are forced to Ta'wil. We are forced to give metaphorical meanings to these attributes. He says, the first point, clarify to them that the aql, the intellect, does not find any of that impossible, meaning the attributes of Allah and their apparent meanings. Clarify that to them. Secondly, clarify to them that the nusus, the text of the Quran and Sunnah that have been mentioned concerning Allah's attributes, do not carry the possibility of ta'wil. They are clear-cut, decisive texts of the Quran and Sunnah that are clear in terms of their meanings. It's not like a word that has a possibility of meaning more than one thing. No, clarify to them that these attributes of Allah, they only have one meaning, only one possible meaning. And so it's impossible for you to do ta'wil concerning them. The third point, most of these matters, Allah's attributes, belief in Allah's attributes, it is known that the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam brought them and taught them. So, concerning Allah's attributes, we know this by necessity. Everyone knows this, that the Prophet ﷺ taught it. Just like he taught as-salawat al-khams. He taught us about praying 5 times a day and fasting the month of Ramadan. He taught us about that. No one denies it. Likewise, he taught us about the attributes of Allah. And so he says, and this is the point here that he's getting to, concerning point number 3. He says, so doing ta'wil with regards to Allah's attributes is just like the Batini sect and the Qaramita. It's just like their ta'wil with respect to Al-Hajj and As-Sawm and As-Salah and the other ibadah. So basically, the Batiniya are those who believe that there are inner meanings. So they say there are outer meanings and there are inner meanings. Most of the ummah, they follow the outer meanings with respect to the ibadah. So they, the ummah, they pray, they fast, they do these things, but we believe in the inner meanings. So praying does not mean physically praying. Fasting does not mean physically restraining from food and drink. Hajj does not mean going to Mecca, etc. All of these things, they have inner meanings. So they did ta'wil. So Ibn Taymiyyah here is saying to the Asha'ira and the Mutakallimun, be consistent. Be consistent. If you want to do ta'wil with regards to Allah's attributes, then do it with regards to the ibadat as well. If we know that the Prophet ﷺ taught us about the ibadat, about praying, fasting, etc., then we also know that the Prophet ﷺ taught us about Allah. Point number 4. To clarify that, the sound intellect corresponds to what has come in the nusus, in the texts of the Quran and Sunnah. Even if in these texts there are details that our intellect cannot comprehend, we do believe in the mujmal. We do believe in the general of these ayat and these ahadith. So we say to them that, look, the sound intellect will never go against what has been mentioned in the authentic sources of our deen. Yes, the details that we cannot comprehend, that is something that our minds cannot comprehend. And that's where we're supposed to stop. And so he says, in the end of mentioning all of this, he says that, the philosophers agree and admit, they acknowledge that the human intellect has its limits. And the human intellect can never reach yaqeen, can never reach certainty with regards to most of what Allah has revealed. So he says, if that is the case, then what is obligatory upon us is to get that knowledge directly from the source. And that is from the Quran and the Sunnah, not from our intellects. Finally, one last thing that we'll cover today. The Shaykh, he goes on to talk about how the Prophet ﷺ explained Iman in two things. The Prophet ﷺ explained to us Iman in Allah and Iman in Yawm al-Akhir, the last day. Why does he mention this? We're going to see. So he says, وَمِنَ الْمَعْلُومِ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ أَنَّ اللَّهَ تعالى بعث محمدا صلى الله عليه وسلم بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله وكفى بالله شهيدا وأنه بين للناس ما أخبرهم الله به من أمور الإيمان بالله واليوم الآخر. He says that it is well known to the believers that Allah sent the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with the right guidance and the religion of truth, and that he clarified for people what Allah has sent him with concerning Iman in Allah and the last day. وَالْإِيمَانُ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ تضمن الإيمان بالمبدأ والمعاد وهو الإيمان بالخلق والبعث كما جمع بينهما في قوله. He says that Iman in Allah and the last day includes Iman in the fact that Allah created us and He will resurrect us. And Allah has combined between these two things in the Quran, between our first creation and our resurrection, basically. And why does Allah do that in the Quran? To refute the mushrikun and the kuffar who say that the resurrection is impossible. Our minds cannot comprehend that. So what does Allah do? Allah brings their attention to the fact that He created them from nothing the first time. If He did that, then creating them, resurrecting them the second time is even easier. So if resurrection is impossible, then how about your first creation? That should have been impossible as well. And then he goes on to mention that Allah sent the Prophet ﷺ clarifying for the people Iman in Allah in the last day. What made it clear that the resurrection will happen and that the Prophet ﷺ is more knowledgeable concerning that than anyone else and the most eloquent in conveying that message. And the one most sincere in wanting to get that message across as well. As we mentioned, these 3 points we mentioned earlier on, that the Prophet ﷺ was the most knowledgeable concerning what he conveyed than anyone else, and the most eloquent in getting that message across. And the third, being the most sincere and wanting to advise his ummah and guide them. And so whoever has these qualities, he basically has combined between knowledge, qudra, power, and irada, a willpower. Here he's talking about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so he says any person speaking who has these three qualities: ilm, qudra, and irada. Knowledge, ability, and willpower. Whatever he says and whatever he does will be perfect. And whatever deficiency comes, it is because he is deficient in one of these three things. So either he is deficient in his knowledge, or in his ability to get the message across, or because he doesn't have the willpower to want to clarify to the people. So notice these three things. Either he doesn't have the knowledge. So basically what he's trying to do here is he's saying that, look, the Prophet ﷺ conveyed the message concerning Allah, concerning the last day, and clarified it with utmost clarity. If he did not, then it means either he is deficient in his knowledge, or he did not have the ability to get that message across to us clearly, or he didn't have the will to do so. And so he says anyone who has the knowledge and the ability to convey that knowledge and the will, he has the will to want to get that message across, that message will get across. That message will definitely get across. And it will get across in the clearest way. And so he concludes by saying, anyone who thinks that someone other than the Messenger ﷺ was more knowledgeable in this, or has the ability to convey these meanings better, or that he is more keen on guiding people, then he is a mulhid. He is from the mulhideen, people of ilhad, not from the mu'mineen, not from the people of iman. والصحابة والتابعين لهم بإحسان ومن سلك سبيل السلف هم في هذا الباب على سبيل الاستقامة. And so he says that the Sahaba and the Tabi'un and whoever follows them and follows the way of the Salaf, they are upon this path. And so this is where we'll stop for today. And after this, the Shaykh will go on to mention three categories of people who deviated concerning Allah's attributes. So this is now another classification of the deviant sects concerning Allah's attributes. He mentions three groups of people concerning how they dealt with the nusus, the texts that mention Allah's attributes. He mentions three groups, and so that's where we'll continue from next week, inshallah ta'ala. So at this point, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. Okay, so if there's no questions, inshallah ta'ala, we can conclude today's session here, inshallah, and we'll see you again next week, bi'idhnillah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.